Hi everyone, and I've, as usual, been having a great time reading all your posts and watching the kind of toing and froing of the thinking on Plato and Socrates and knowing and not knowing, and it's a little bit like surfing or something. It's fun to watch, but what I would like to say is, and I think this is what's happening. This is what you're doing is to, as much as possible, not to come to conclusions. That let this be an inquiry that we all enjoy without having to come to an answer. And one, while I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Ken Wilber, one I think of his really great contributions was the idea of vision logic, which is and this may come later in the course. I'm not sure. I don't remember, but which is his developmental stage that is beyond the rational. There's a lot of wind today, so we'll see if this works. So so most prior developmental schemes stopped at the rational. And he goes on to the transrational, but before the transrational is this stage of vision logic, and the stage of vision logic is the one which is able to be what he calls aperspectival, which is the ability to hold differing views without preferencing one view over the other, except when context dependent, when context sort of demands it or suggests it. It's the ability to hold even opposing views without preferencing, holding them both as true or as both as wrong. And in this developmental stage of vision logic, there really isn't an absolute right or wrong. It's not entirely relativist either. But it is this ability that there could be multiple views which one would hold. You're big enough. You're big enough to hold multiple views. You're big enough to hold even opposing views. The universe is infinite. The universe is big enough to hold this view, and it's big enough to hold that view. So with respect to all of these thoughts that we have, I think for me that it became one of the ways to get past the discursive mind was simply to say, hey, mind, everything you're saying is right. Everything you could say is right, or it's both right and wrong. And I probably didn't explain the aperspectival mode very well, but that was my shot. So let's see if we can sort of stay in that mode, because my experience was that if I could really get myself in that mode of not deciding from here, there might be the possibility of insight, and I've had some quite substantial experiences getting in that mode and then having insight sort of strike me from beyond all of the modes, and I think that would be a great way to head forth in this course. With respect to Plato, actually, Ken Wilber is significant. I think we're reading a chapter called "The Way Up is the Way Down." It's a chapter from Ken Wilber's really thick book, in which he talks about Plato and very definitely comes down on the side of Plato being a finger pointing at the moon, and a mystical interpretation. And this doesn't come necessarily from the dialogues, but it comes from his letters, the epistles. And I'm going to read a quote. Okay. Yeah. See how this goes down. This is a quote from the 7th epistle written by Plato. But this much, at any rate, I can affirm about any present or future writers who pretend to knowledge of the matters with which I concern myself. Parentheses, mystical knowledge of the one. In my judgment, it is impossible that they should have any understanding of the subject. It is not something that can be put into words like other branches of learning. Only after long partnership in a common life parentheses, contemplative community, devoted to this very thing, does truth flash upon the soul, like a flame kindled by a leaping spark. No treatise by me concerning it exists or will ever exist. And Ken Wilber, I'm reading this quote, Ken Wilber's included it in his book, but he also includes a quote by Alfred North Whitehead, who was a British philosopher at the beginning of the last century. The safest general characterization of the whole of Western philosophy, the Western philosophic tradition, is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. And here's Ken Wilber writing. It has always struck me as odd that so much of our Western tradition is supposed to be a series of footnotes to Plato, and yet the crucial book to which we are all footnotes was never written. No treatise by me concerning it exists or will ever exist. Quote. Scholars generally agree that Plato was here referring to the mystical knowledge of the One, the good, beyond being, as Plato also calls it. There apparently was the heart of the Platonic message, and yet that he never committed to print, whereas he had no trouble writing volumes on ethics or the archetypal forms, epistemology, politics, love, and so forth. But on that central point, Plato was silent as only he could be. That knowledge or divine ignorance is not verbal but transverbal. It is not of the mind, but of no mind. It is not part of a discursive philosophy or merely talking religion, but a contemplative flash of truth in the soul. And while this truth or sudden illumination can be directly and injunctively shown by long contemplative practice and community, as Plato put it, it cannot be fully said or verbally passed on, without the corresponding development signified in any individual. The true footnotes on that knowledge would be merely a series of empty circles and fingers pointing to the moon. So I'm just throwing that out there that I think that, and as Ken Wilber says, although we have to trust him, most scholars would agree that he was referring to the mystical knowledge of the One. So that in a way, all of his previous works were a form of finger pointing at the moon, but he was never going to talk directly about it. And he says as much, basically, in these letters. The other perhaps relevant fact is that the entire sort of body of philosophy known as Neoplatonism, which is very definitely mystical, grew after Plato's death over a number of centuries. And all of the writings on that point back to Plato as the source of these mystical ideas. And in fact, the very idea of the perennial philosophy comes mostly from Plotinus, who was a Neoplatonist and acknowledges Plato as the source of all of his writings. And so there's an explicit mystical philosophy that's really at least growing out of Plato. Whether that's merited or not, I don't know. Nevertheless, it happened. So those are my 2 cents on Plato, and but I say, let's just stay open. You know, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, a finger pointing at the moon. For me, he has functioned that way, and so therefore, it's been true for me. The finger pointing at the moon aspect of Plato has been true for me. And that's regardless of what the facts were. I don't know. It's just my own experience. And as we've been saying, that's all we've got. Perhaps that's all we've got. So now we're skipping off. This coming week, we're skipping over. In the 14-week course, we had time to read Tarnas, more of the intervening part of Tarnas, for the early Middle Ages, or what we used to call the Dark Ages. But we're skipping over that to sort of more the sort of true Middle Ages, and reading that part. And so that takes us into the Renaissance, and that's this coming week. So I think we'll see that Plato and Aristotle are still extremely relevant to the picture and still play a role, and a very interesting role. And I'm going to, let's see, at the end of this week, I'm going to send you an article by a historian of science that makes this sort of role of Plato and Aristotle even more clear as it played out in the scientific revolution and in coming into the scientific revolution. And it's a very interesting article because it gives a completely different picture on the relationship between Christianity and science, the early relationship between Christianity and science. And I think our ideas on that have really changed over the last 40 or 50 years. So there may be some surprises in there, and they're all surprises. This form are always good. Yeah. So this week is going to be more Tanas and winding up to the when the real action seems to start. Okay, have a good week, and thanks for all your posts. Bye.